Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to be with you this morning and in the Asia and Pacific region. I want to thank the organizers for making possible this opportunity to share knowledge and to share best practice, as well as to share practices that need to be improved. This year, I have the honor to chair the World Economic Forum Global Advisory Council on the Future of Government. At the annual meeting in Davos, we released a discussion paper, and in early June, our council will release a major report on the future of government. We made for the Davos meeting 4 primary recommendations, all of which relate very closely to e-government developments. The first is that governments are increasingly networked. So we increasingly speak of networked governance, dealing with interrelationships within governments, across boundaries and across jurisdictions, relationships across governments in regions, in global associations, at the central, local, and provincial levels, and also across sectors in public-private partnerships, in an array of multi-sectoral arrangements through which governance is developed and delivered, and not least of which in these networks is the role of civil society and the public in becoming networked across civil society groups, but also in providing feedback and eyes on their governments. So the first recommendation was that governments around the world must think more carefully about networked governance. The second recommendation was that we need to find ways to accelerate the sharing of best practice, accelerate the sharing of practices that don't work. And there are many forums and formats for doing this. This is one of them, and a very good example. The third recommendation has to do with the future of the civil service. Civil servants in many countries, my own included, need further training, better education to prepare them for the challenges of the 21st century, primarily challenges around information societies, knowledge economies, and what governments can do to be facilitators of information societies. Our current training for civil servants in every country in the world is deficient with respect to opportunities, possibilities for e-government. And finally, the fourth recommendation comes in the area of metrics and measures, which we've heard quite a bit about this morning. Many of the measures that we are using were perfectly adequate measures in the 1990s, at the beginning of the 21st century, but are we measuring adequately cross-jurisdictional capacity and potential? Are we measuring adequately networked government, the agility of governments, the flexibility of governments? Are we measuring adequately the role of civil society, of citizen engagement? We see movements toward this end, particularly in the last 2 addresses to this group. What I want to bring you this morning are some examples from around the world that come from primarily outside your region, and this is meant to be a broadening exercise. My own research center is the National Center for Digital Government that was originally supported and started by the United States National Science Foundation to be a catalyst for a new area of study. It's about 10 years old, and at that time, some of you may remember, people thought the internet might be a fad and that e-government might be a fad, something that governments would decide whether they wanted to be involved in or not. We see, of course, that is not at all true, and that what we are actually doing is not simply providing the same services online, but that we are reinventing, we are rethinking the state and national development. It has been very interesting in the translations of this book into Japanese, into Chinese, to see that many of the fundamental ideas and challenges flow across countries. Since that time, of course, in the United States and many other countries, the idea of wiki-government, as Beth Novak, who is the head of open government in the United States, has called it, has taken hold. So what is our outline? To look at some national e-government strategies, to look at long-term national e-government developments. We want to do lots of things quickly, but the fact is that transformation of anything as complex as governments takes place over time. And some of these changes require a certain pacing and an ability of countries to absorb consequences in implementation. We'll look at some current developments, particularly around social media, open government, and open data, which is an idea, a set of ideas sweeping the world, and then see some country examples. National and government. I want to be very clear, as many of our speakers have been so far, that e-government focuses on services, but it is not simply about provision of services. These are primarily front office applications. In order to supply services well online, the back office often has to be re-engineered, streamlined, reconceptualized. Going even further back, we begin with e-government to rethink government operations. In my own country, since the early 1990s, we have been successively streamlining and reanalyzing. We do it for a period of time. We come away from it while we absorb the changes. We go back to it again. So there is a kind of iterative nature to this. It is not done once and for all through one project at one point in time. These are long-term. The third area, also mentioned, is citizen engagement and participation. This is also a part of e-government. The high failure rate of IT projects is in part due to lack of interest or lack of desire on the part of the public for such projects. And then finally, efficiency, productivity, quality, and innovative capacity is part of e-government. Whatever is current today will be outmoded by next year. So by the time our projects are finished, they are often already outmoded, and we're ready for the next projects. Continuing with this definition, broadening and deepening in the definition of e-government, we can think of a virtual state, which is intersectoral, going across public, private, nonprofit sectors. It is interagency or interministerial, intergovernmental. Social networking provides a kind of fluidity and an ability to work across boundaries. Underlying this is greater standardization, greater rationalization of processes, greater transparency, and strategic management. Strategic here meaning with a view to the creation of public value. What are some of the chronic problems we see in every country, rich or poor? A tendency is to put the status quo online. We can all build websites, but what will our countries put on those websites? If we are not using ICT as a catalyst, as a lever for change, then we are simply reproducing the status quo. Islands of automation is another challenge. It's very easy when we're working with a project portfolio to develop lots of projects that may not coalesce into one cohesive strategy. We can actually make the stovepipes and the vertical nature of government even worse as we embed it into a digital world. And after we have sunk those costs into programs, software, hardware systems, it can become even more difficult to work across boundaries if we're not careful about design. There is a great deal of redundancy in information projects. We see this in the United States. We see it in many countries. Governments are collecting the same information over and over again and placing the same information in many different ministries. It wastes the time of citizens. It produces databases that are redundant and inefficient. And so we need to root out these redundancies. Poor program management is another area. Most of our civil servants, many of our IT leaders were not trained in program management. They're managing very complex portfolios, a great deal of money, fast-moving, dynamic technologies, often with few skills, with not enough people. So having e-government doesn't replace the middle layers that are required for good oversight and strong project management. And then finally, poor modernization strategies. In many ministries, there is not a strategy for modernization. There is simply a desire to have more ICT. And so often these projects don't go in the direction that a government needs. So for this reason, having at the top levels and filtered all the way through the government, an e-government strategy is critical. So while we are borrowing best practices from one another and putting together interesting projects, there must be an overall strategy, a set of goals that are going to move a country forward in its modernization path. These goals come not simply from what is possible to do with technology, but what are the chief needs of the country, economically, politically, and socially. Those are the first step to crafting an e-government strategy, and the e-government strategy should be in the service of the economic, political, and social needs. One example that many countries are using is ICT to support entrepreneurship, to help small businesses get started. We've had examples this morning, one-stop shops for business licensing, ways to remove the red tape for people who want to start businesses, who want to scale up their businesses. These are fundamental to economic development. More strategy. Every country is different, has a different culture, different history, different place in its aspirations, in its views toward modernization. In many countries, a starting point for strategy, along with economic challenges, social and political challenges, is country identity and culture. If we are all using similar ICTs, we are not necessarily going to become more similar as countries. So there needs to be a way to build into designs and systems a respect and appreciation for country identity, for cultural identity. These are not simply technocratic projects. They are projects that help to embed histories, cultures, values into this new area of e-government. For the underlying requirements for ICTs, very often human capital development is thought about in terms of the potential users and the citizens who will be using e-government, but we need to think of the human capital development in terms of the experts and the managers who will be responsible for building and maintaining these projects. If we think about a country like Singapore, which we've heard one of the top, obviously, countries in e-government in the world, a very small country, going back to the 1980s and before, some of you may remember, Hong Kong developed something called TradeLink. They want to make their port transshipment fast, efficient, thereby to attract more business and to be a competitive port. Singapore looks at its national assets, at its future as a country, and they recognize that their port and their ability to be a transshipment center is key to their economic development. They start to develop something called TradeNet before the World Wide Web, before the internet as we know it today, back in the old days of intranets and electronic data interchange. But what they were doing at that time was working across boundaries, across agencies, connecting data from businesses to government. Many of the same things that we are trying to do today with newer technologies. They use this project as a platform not only to increase trade administration capacity, to make their port internationally competitive and one of the best in the world, but as a lever for what becomes the intelligent island strategy. So we see this kind of platforming and leveraging from one major project to another. As capacity is built, that capacity can then be used to build more ambitious projects. Throughout, from the 1980s and beyond, high investments in education were made. Yes, Singapore is a wealthy country, but they recognized that the human capital investments for everyone in the society would be critical for their high-tech strategy to be recognized and to work. Similarly, high investments in civil service education and training have been core to produce one of the stellar civil services around the world. So these are some of the costs and some of the investments that have to be made for e-government as well. I'll go more quickly. With respect to the United States, we see again a long-term strategy. The point of these slides is that these are several decades of development. It's not possible to simply have a plug-and-play e-government. You buy the system, you plug it in, you are then modern. Malta, to use a different example, a very tiny island country, decides to become an ICT hub and to be ranked in the top 10. This is their aspiration. They have a population less than 500,000 people. They have built themselves as a freight transshipment point, a financial center, tourist destination. One of the things that they're doing that is quite important is that they have at the bottom, an eGov services demand survey, and they are continually asking their businesses and their citizens, what do they want, what do they need in terms of e-government? So developments are in very close relationship with the answers that they're getting to those questions. So some of the key points here are the following. Is there equitable, affordable access to e-government? How are telecoms being managed? How is pricing being arranged? These are fundamental issues across many, many countries. Third, are politicians, are policymakers ready? We ask about e-government readiness. We might have an e-government readiness survey for politicians and policymakers. Are they ready for e-government? Are they ready to make difficult choices? We've talked about whole of government approaches. This diagram, I realize you can't read all the words, is think of it as a graphical depiction. This was an exercise we did in the United States before the Bush administration, more than 10 years ago now, to take every ministry in the government, to take all of the critical business functions, to array them as a matrix, and then to ask how are databases configured, how are services configured, where do we see the same kinds of services being created in a redundant way so that citizens won't know where to go. This was an effort, again, in this iterative process of streamlining, of becoming more efficient, of thinking of the government as a whole, an enterprise view of the government, as you will. And what was done in this case, the X's were to show this is where systems have been built, And so where we saw that there were 12 or 15 systems across ministries that were basically doing the same thing, even in a country as wealthy as the United States, it was very obvious that we could not afford to build multiple systems that were replicating one another or where there was considerable overlap. And this was the result of having many, many projects, many, many successful projects, but not having a sufficiently strategic view. So again, through this iterative process, we need to continually interrogate the portfolio. So we see exciting projects in Asia and the Pacific. These are just a few more. Intelligent airports in Indonesia, remote sensing satellites in Vietnam, Philippine city government offices and schools sharing internet connections, Singapore, the Prime Minister chatting on Facebook. These and other developments are the kinds of point-specific innovations we see, but we have to think about how they relate in a portfolio management situation to a cohesive strategy. Let me move quickly. I'm standing between you and lunch, to social media, to open government, to open data. Many people have become quite excited about citizen co-production of information and services. When we move to this place, citizens are not only gathering information for governments, they are supplying information to governments. They are interacting with one another and teaching one another. They become co-producers of services, not simply consumers of services. Another question that is coming up is how much citizen engagement we really want. We can build platforms, but there is a political question here, no? A social question as well. What will we do with all of this engagement? And is the policy process ready and willing to uptake, to adopt some of the outputs? We don't know yet very well how to turn citizen engagement into problem solving. We don't have good connections between policy-making apparatus and citizen engagement apparatus. And this is some of the middleware that will have to be developed. We also don't know very well who is online. What types of citizens are going online? What types of citizens are not engaging? This is a different view from representative government, where we know exactly who the representatives are and who they represent. In an online world, anyone who wants to engage, engages, but we are not sure about the representative nature of these processes. Open government and open data have swept the world as a kind of movement, and countries have different views. So let me move quickly through what some of these concepts mean. The basic concept here is to open government data to the public. In England, in the United Kingdom this fall, for the first time in their history, in the history of the country, they developed freedom of information legislation, opening up much more of the government's data and information to the public. In the United States, we're a very open country, but we are constantly debating what information should be open, what information should not be open. So in every country, these are matters of debate, and these debates are going to continue, and they are very healthy debates. New legislation is being passed in countries like Indonesia, in Mexico, in Turkey, in India, about rights to information. Laws are being passed requiring government ministries to make information available to the public. These are not things that civil servants and that ministries are likely to do on their own. They require legislation. They require political acts in order to move these things forward. Transparency and accountability is very much a part of open government and open data. Tracking systems in countries like India, Kenya, Brazil, and many, many others are using citizen engagement as a way to monitor, to expose inefficiencies and corruption. These are activities for citizen engagement, and they can help governments to become more efficient, more effective, more honest. Open data portals are growing in many, many countries, in Australia, in Canada, in Estonia, in Norway, United Kingdom, United States, New Zealand. There's a very important study going on in 3 countries, Chile, Ghana, and Turkey, called the Open Government Data Feasibility Study. It turns out that for citizens to download and get access to these data, or for governments to post these databases, requires much more capacity than many governments have. Again, even in the United States, we're crashing the systems of some agencies when people are trying to download public databases that have been put up on public data access sites. So these have heavy infrastructure needs. Let's look at some examples. In Catalonia, the autonomous region of Catalonia within Spain, here's a view of GenCat, which is their one-stop shop for government. What you can see here are guides and statements from the Parliament, from the President, from throughout the government, proceedings online, ways to book appointments with doctors. You see an example of a very fine one-stop shop, whole-of-government portal approach that was mentioned earlier this morning. You see also on this site cultural offerings, arts, restoration, heritage, as well as economics, and the ability for people to try to find jobs online, to look for education and training opportunities, to help to manage their health. So it's a way to bring the government in a more cohesive way to its citizens. Recently, in Catalonia, open data catalogs are being published, and this is what the page looks like. You can see on the left side in a box, it says, participate in the project. What data do you think should be opened? Do you know of any examples? Do you have ideas of applications? One of the ideas behind open data is that smart people, often young people, will develop applications, mapping, visualization, other apps that can use these data. So this is an idea, again, to get citizens co-producing new services. Not all of these things have to be developed by IT firms or by the government. There's a lot of opportunity for citizen engagement. Here's an example from Norway, eGovMon, e-government monitoring. This is a site and a project that is set up, even in a country like Norway, which is quite advanced, quite egalitarian, to increase accessibility, to increase transparency, to increase efficiency, to increase the impact of projects. And this is a way for the government to develop tools, develop methodologies, develop a continuous interaction with businesses and the public to find out how they are receiving, what are their perceptions of new services, new projects, what are their perceptions of the priorities and the needs of the society and the economy. An example from the US, just one part of open government, something called challenge.gov. This is a way to crowdsource, to use the vernacular, to throw out to the public challenges the government has, to ask the public to help them solve them. I'm not sure if this is a good idea or not. It seems very American. We are using prizes and awards. So the way that this works is that a ministry has a challenge, a problem that it would like to solve. It writes it up. So this is the top one, Center for Disease Control, Flu Influenza Application Challenge. There are a number of data sets that the Centers for Disease Control have. They are inviting people to write apps to create value around that data. And they are offering, I think it's $34,000 for anyone who writes a very useful app. This could be a college student who would write it, postdoc, a software developer who simply wants to take up that challenge. There are many, many challenges on this website, and we're finding that good ideas can come from anywhere in the society, and often they come from unexpected and unlikely places. So not every application developed will be a winner, of course. They have to be vetted. But it's another way of increasing participation, of engagement. So again, citizens are not just consuming services, they are helping to create them. On a different note, this is the IT dashboard. As countries are economically constrained, whether they are donor or donee nations, we cannot afford to waste money on projects that won't work. This is a way to look across ministries at IT spending. Many countries are using these dashboards. You can get a sense of which projects are not performing well, which projects are over budget, which projects are not going well, and then this helps with the portfolio management of projects, and it moves the government away from a fragmented approach of looking at one project at a time. So these are some powerful visualization, mapping, analytical tools that governments can use internally. And by the way, this is public, so that any citizen or anyone in the world can have a look at the portfolio of projects and see for themselves which ones are performing, which ones are not. The Open Government Initiative in the US has focused on transparency, participation, collaboration. Many other countries are adopting these as well. I'll go quickly here. Here is our data.gov site. It looks different in other countries. We've put all of the government's apps online. We found that some agencies were procuring and paying for apps that the government already owned. In such a large government as that in the United States, one ministry doesn't know what another ministry is doing. We can't afford to have these kinds of gaps in knowledge. All of the apps are there. Anyone in the government can find them and see what they can download for free or what contracts the government has entered into. There are many more innovations. Let's turn to citizen engagement. Some of you may be familiar with Ushahidi. It is a platform, an open platform, originally developed in Africa by software developers in Africa. Someone had said there should be a way to use our visualization and mapping tools to make visible when we see voter fraud or problems with voting processes. A group of software developers got together and created a very simple, low-cost platform that uses user-generated content to display and to analyze information. This is a picture of David Kobia. MIT Technology Review in 2010 called him the Humanitarian of the Year for developing this. Ushahidi means testimony in Swahili. What you see here is a smartphone and the map that can result. So this is mobile. It's using mobile devices and asking people to, in many cases, SMS text message information. There is a way to map the information and to trace incidents over time in order to create information databases. Here are some of the projects. Ushahidi platform has been used for crime mapping, for voter fraud detection, for after the earthquake in Haiti, after the earthquake in Chile. I'll show you some of the applications. Here's one that is developed in Kenya for tracking wildlife. What you see here is a map of the area, and along the right-hand side, a variety of categories, very interesting categories: lion sightings, rhino sightings, cheetah sightings, elephant sightings, cattle in parks, fire in parks, wildlife and ivory trade, poaching, wildlife poisoning, wildlife rescues, amazing sightings, rare birds, bushmeat. The idea behind this is that when people see information, maybe in remote locations, maybe in ways that they want to contribute, but they want to be anonymous, they can contribute it to this website. The information is mapped. You see one graph at the bottom of the slide showing incidences over time, and this becomes a way to gather information. So notice here, the government is not paying for someone to go out and collect this information. This information is coming in from the public, coming in from citizens. So this is an opportunity, I think particularly in poor countries but wealthy countries as well, to use citizen engagement as a way to build information, public information, that everyone can use. Here are two other examples. After the earthquake in Haiti, this was a map of various needs of the population. You could see these changing in real time. Here's one of the original maps, voting rights abuses in Sudan. And you can see the power of having a picture, a map, a visualization. After the Haiti earthquake, the call volumes quickly overwhelmed the telephone system. It was not going to be possible for international organizations that went in to do disaster relief, emergency relief, to simply use the phone system. They began using text messages in order to try to get a quick needs assessment, needs for medical aid, for clean water, for shelter, and to quickly determine what was going on. There were many organizations who were part of this. Some were business firms, some were NGOs, some were government organizations, and they could share their data around this platform. Let me say that this did not work without problems. It's not a magical solution. And we still, what we don't know how to do very well, as I mentioned, is how to take this crowdsourced data and then how should it be fed into the routines of large, complex organizations. This is a very real question for many international organizations. So let me wrap up. Some of the lessons learned from this kind of citizen engagement is that there is a lot of learning going on. We can see undiscovered paths, but complex organizations, bureaucracies, international organizations, and governments work through routines, through procedures. So we have to know how to connect up this dynamic form of information gathering with the routines, the procedures, the standardized processes that are used for things like disaster relief, emergency relief. There was also the need for a management of expectations. People expected when they sent a text message about a need for food, for water, for shelter, that someone would respond to that need. But all they were really doing is mapping the need. So we did not always have a precise match or a good match at all between the ability to respond to these needs and the ability for people to report them. So in the case of the Pakistan floods, people were trying to be careful to tell people that they were reporting their observations and that they wouldn't necessarily be calling an emergency number and getting a response right away. This is all part of our learning. So how do we build in successful organizational change, the kinds of changes that are going to bring us to a new virtual state. At the macro level, we have a number of institutional factors. Some are political, some have to do with leadership, some have to do with budgets, some with culture. At the meso or the middle level, we have a range of organizational changes in our routines, in our procedures, in the re-engineering that has to be done. And then at the individual level, these are the kinds of human capital requirements, team building requirements, project building requirements, all of which at all of these three levels are required for successful changes. So the government of the future requires strong national e-government strategies, requires civil servants for the 21st century, requires civil servants who see themselves as knowledge workers, as brokers, serving the public, using digital tools with a strong sense of public service, this notion of virtue, and a strong understanding of their policy and programmatic domains. Information and communication technologies alone cannot do it all. These are complex processes. Thank you very much.